Welcome back, y'all. Ready for round two? This time we're going to be taking a look at some albums that changed the game in one form or another. But before we get to it, I need to remind you to hit that like button, ring that subscribe bell, and show me support so we can keep this thing going. With a few exceptions, before Frank Sinatra released In the Wee Small Hours in 1955, there wasn't much consensus in the music industry around how to produce an album. The LP was still a young medium, so most albums were 7 or 10-inch singles bundled together, and artists that did embrace the longer format merely thought of it as a convenient way to package a collection of hits. Sinatra wasn't most artists, and In the Wee Small Hours was his 9th go-round album-wise. He'd already been playing with which songs of his should be packaged together, and this time he was laser-focused on keeping the work thematically tight. Every song on the album is swan song-esque, with feelings of loneliness and lost love, introspection and solitary desperation woven throughout. Even the painted album cover sets the mood with its blue lighting and desolate streetscape. Considered by many to be the first concept album to hit the charts, In the Wee Small Hours set a new standard for everything that came after. Artists would still focus on singles, and record companies would still mostly use albums as hits collections for another decade, but the stage was set so that when the album era descended upon pop in full force, there was a blueprint in place for how to create greatness. There's a lot to be said for Elvis Presley's eponymous first album. It was the first rock and roll album to top the charts and the first to sell 1 million copies. Despite that, it wasn't a real hitmaker for the King in the singles department, outside of Blue Suede Shoes. Instead, it was an album full of cover songs and personal favorites that were recorded in a rush so his new label could capitalize on his popularity. Although it only did a quarter of the sales of Hound Dog, selling 1 million copies in 1956 is no joke. Elvis Presley was everywhere, and as influential as he was a performer among his peers, the cover of his album was a lightning rod for fans. He didn't just sound cool, he looked cool. Handsome but still baby-faced, energetically singing and dancing while he played, Elvis made every teenager with a tin of pomade in their bathroom want to own a guitar. He also proved to the major labels that he could move merchandise, making rock and roll a viable investment. The flood that followed reshaped popular music in America, merging rhythm and blues with rockabilly and delivering both to a suburban U.S. that had rarely heard either. Rock died its first death before the decade's end, but not before its reach extended off the continent and its influence was delivered to the 4 British lads we're talking about next. When Beatlemania struck our friends across the pond, Americans were delighted by the absurdity of it all. Rock and roll was over. Elvis was a movie star singing to housewives, and US teens didn't want to listen to a rhythm and blues cover band even if they did have cute English accents. When Beatlemania struck the United States, major players in the music business were aghast they had called it so wrong, bungled it up so bad in fact that Capitol Records, the company that held the US distribution rights to the Fab Four's work, was responsible for the Beatles' second stateside release rather than their first. That album was Meet the Beatles, a collection of mostly original numbers that included I Wanna Hold Your Hand, a single that was selling millions of copies. But Meet the Beatles was no slouch and sold its own millions of copies, eventually outselling the single, something that had never happened in the US music industry. The Beatles would prove the strength of the album time and again, with masterpieces like Revolver, Rubber Soul, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band considered standouts that ushered in the album era. But it was the Fab Four's first album in the US that caused their label to stay out of their way while they did what needed doing. Ray Charles spent the better half of the back half of the 50s reinventing popular music. He influenced rock and roll and helped architect early soul. By the end of the decade, he was seeing crossover success strong enough that he just kept on keeping on while the music industry fell apart around him. The start of the 60s saw him experimenting, and he embraced the concept album. He had his first #1 pop hit with Georgia on My Mind, which came off of an album full of songs about different places. He made a big band album and a blues album, and then in 1962, he made a country album. Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music is a selection of country standards interpreted through one of the greatest rhythm and blues musicians alive at the time. Ever really. It was an album that nobody thought would work, and at the same time nobody could do anything about, because Charles had managed to score complete creative freedom when he renewed his contract with his label. After it was released, the album sold 500,000 copies in under 3 months. It was a landmark recording that was played on both black and white radio stations, and its combination of soul and country stylings helped shape both the rhythm and blues and country to come. More importantly, however, is that it united audiences. One of the most glaring problems with American pop music is its historically entrenched divide between what's seen as white music and what's seen as black music. But Charles proved that you could create a record that was both. Billy Joel described modern sounds in country and western music as a black man giving you the whitest possible music in the blackest possible way. And the album's 14-week stay at number one on the pop charts proved more than the entirety of the 50s rock revolution that people were ready for it. I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You is Aretha Franklin's 11th studio album. 12th technically, but the last album she recorded for Columbia Records wasn't released for another few years. More important, however, is that I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You is Franklin's first album with Atlantic Records, making it the second first album on the list. The 10 albums Franklin released prior to her move to Atlantic didn't accomplish much beyond middling success. She could sell songs in the strength of her voice alone, but producers at Columbia held her back with traditional arrangements and standards meant to create a new Ella Fitzgerald or Dinah Washington. But Franklin was neither, and Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records knew that. After signing her to Atlantic, he famously told the media that they were taking her back to church. The release of I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You proved that he was putting his money where his mouth was. Unconstrained by phantoms of convention and backed by the famed Muscle Shoals rhythm section, her vocals announced not just her arrival to pure soul, but her intentions to completely embody it. The album shot to number one on the R&B charts and stopped just shy of the top of the pops. It was followed by a 2-decade string of hit albums that few artists can match. Her gospel roots allowed her to put a depth of emotion into soul that raised the bar for everyone involved and paved the way for contemporary R&B. And that's that, kittens and cats. If any of the albums I mentioned here piqued your interest, I strongly suggest pulling them up on your streaming service of choice and checking them out. Or hit up your local record store and see if you can't get your hands on a vinyl copy, if that's how you do. These albums shape pop music in one way or another. They're immortal because they affected an enormous number of people since their release, and they're destined to affect even more as they're discovered by new generations of music lovers. But there are a lot of albums out there affecting a lot of people. Which of them affect you? Which album or albums shaped the way you look at music, or influence the musicians you listen to? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that subscribe bell so you can get notified whenever I kick the new knowledge. Next time, I'm going to talk about concerts. I miss live music.